Hi everyone, welcome to the second video on Kant's Prolegomena to any future metaphysics. This is the video for week 16. Congratulations, we all made it. We're so close to the semester being over. I know that I mentioned this in an announcement. I don't want to be too gooey, sappy all the time, but I just do want to say that it's been a real pleasure for me to be able to read all of your writings and reflections on the early modern period. I can tell that, many of you took this material to heart. You took it really seriously and you tried to wrestle with the questions that the early moderns raised very deeply. And that to me is a certain sign of a high philosophical aptitude. So, that's just to say that this class has been a real joy for me in many ways. I understand that for a lot of people, reading material from this period is very painful. So I appreciate that you all have stuck with me as long as you have. Now, as many of you have noticed, I posted the discussion forum for week 16 early. We're primarily there going to be talking about sort of like broad overview things for the entire semester, but you're also willing or not willing, you're also able to discuss the content for this lecture for week 16 if you would like, but you're by no means obligated to do so. I would be remiss if I didn't mention also that your final papers are coming up. Please see the rubric that's posted on Canvas for all of the particular details about my expectations for that paper, as well as the due date, which is listed at the end of the syllabus. If you have any questions, if you need more time, anything like that, please reach out to me as soon as possible. It's much easier to give you leeway as far as an extension or something like that the earlier that you come to me. Similarly, if you've been working with me independently and we've had to work out an alternative arrangement for finishing your coursework by the end of the semester, please reach out to me soon so that we can make sure that we have all of the materials that you're going to turn into the semester turned in. Okay, so that's mostly housekeeping stuff. So I would also like to remind you, please, again, if you have not already, please fill out the course evaluation form. If you write good things or bad things, honestly, both of them help me improve as a teacher and make sure that in the future, if I get to teach another course like this again, that I can make sure to improve it, to make it a positive experience for you all, because that's really my goal. Okay. So with that being said, I want this to be a short video, relatively, 20 to 30 minutes, and what I really would like to discuss is the foundations for what Kant calls his formal or transcendental idealism. Now, you're much more likely to find the terminology transcendental idealism than formal idealism. Kant kind of plays with that language for the purposes of the Prolegomena, but then he kind of moves away from it again. So you're not typically going to see people describe Kant's philosophy as a kind of formal idealism. Instead, most of the time you will hear it referred to as a kind of transcendental idealism. And what that usually means is that Kant is investigating the conditions for our possible experience and trying to determine in a principled way how far do our sources of knowledge really go. And so what Kant argues is that we have three distinct cognitive faculties that he calls sensibility, understanding, and reason. This is rather important, and it's definitely a big innovation in this period of philosophy, right? Recall, for example, in a figure like Descartes, or really any of the rationalists that we're talking about, For them, sensibility is just a confused kind of understanding, right? There's no difference in principle between them. It's just that this kind of knowledge is really unclear, whereas, conceptual knowledge that we get from our understanding or through reason or what is exemplified whenever we're engaged in mathematical kinds of judgments, those come from the understanding. Similarly, from the perspective of the empiricist, the situation is the reverse. For them, there is no autonomous principle or something like that, independent faculty that is the understanding that deals primarily with concepts. No, as we saw in Hume, all concepts, all ideas that we have are dependent on impressions, and in that way are just like a faint impression, right? Memories are just sort of the leftover fragments of the impressions that we happen to have. So what we can see is that in both the rationalist as well as the empiricist philosophical traditions in the early modern period, they conceived of sensibility and the understanding, roughly like our ability to sense things and our ability to reason about things. They thought this only formed one faculty, right? And sometimes it worked really well, and other times it did not work really well. By contrast, Kant wants to divide up our cognitive process into distinct, segmented areas that each have an individual function that cannot be replaced with one another. So for Kant, the understanding can't do what the sensibility does. It can't give us knowledge of like the particular things that we run into the world all the time. And similarly, sensibility on its own doesn't organize our knowledge in a way that makes it possible for us to have what Kant calls cognition. So one way of framing Kant's innovation is to say that in all cognitive processes that work correctly, right, in all cases where we have genuine cognition or knowledge, that there is a mixture of the sensibility and the understanding. So, in order to really understand the picture of what Kant is trying to say, then what we need to do is we need to give an analysis of what Kant takes to be the independent sources of cognition and to see how far they go. And we'll see that doing this process will make sense of Kant's conclusions from the previous week, namely the source for our mathematical kinds of knowledge, the source for our synthetic a priori judgments in physics, as well as, my head is in the way here, metaphysics, right? It will explain the difference in kind between these two kinds of inquiry, which do make progress and are legitimate, and this kind of inquiry, which is not legitimate and does not make progress over time. And in this way, we're going to see that Kant kind of closes the book, right, on the history of modern metaphysics, which is more or less what we've been following up to this point. Okay, so now before I go through the rows, I want to talk about the columns. So for Kant, each faculty has an ordinary usage, a pure usage, and a kind of scientific inquiry of some kind that follows from its pure usage. So what we're going to see is that it's always going to be easiest to begin with the ordinary usage, then to reflect on, okay, well, what if, I got rid of all the aspects of this that didn't come from that faculty and I focused purely on what that faculty gives, right? And so, Kant talks about pure a priori concepts or pure reason. or something like that, right? And so we want to examine what sensibility or the understanding or reason looks like when it is used purely or all on its own. And it will turn out that there's a kind of inquiry that follows from the pure usage of that faculty. So you can kind of see in general a little arrow like this, you know, moving from one column to the next. The ordinary usage is in some way dependent on the pure usage, and the science's pure form is in some way also dependent on the pure form here. Okay, that's a little bit unclear, but let's start to flesh this out by giving some examples, right? So sensibility, what Kant has in mind by this faculty is our ability to be affected by stuff, right? So the fact that I open my eyes and I see a whole world of individuated objects before me, right? Before I even apply a concept, right? Before I can identify, I can be like, this is a phone or something like that, right? Before that, I just kind of see it as some thing, right? I see it as an individuated, singular thing that I don't yet have a concept for. And this is the ordinary usage of sensibility. In our ordinary everyday lives, we are surrounded constantly in our experience by a bunch of objects that we see as individual, singular objects that we have a kind of immediate relationship to. That relationship is immediate precisely because it is not mediated by a concept, right? So like whether or not I have the concept phone, for example, I still see this thing here, right? And so what this kind of shows in some way is that the ordinary usage of sensibility is just that when we see and perceive and experience in various ways the objects of our natural life world, right? Okay, so one thing that's obvious, right, is that the fact that this phone, this object of my sensibility that I perceive, right, it's pink. It has a pink case, right? Now, what is the source of my knowledge of its pink case? Well, the fact that it's pink, right, that doesn't say anything about how I perceive things, right? I perceive things in a whole bunch of different colors. So there's all this like not pink stuff that I also happen to perceive, right? Things that are maybe black or various other kinds of colors, right? And so when I'm searching for an explanation for why it is that, the object has the properties that I am identifying, those don't belong to its form, right? They don't belong just to anything that I sense or something like that. It belongs to the matter or the content of the specific thing that I'm perceiving. So, it's not a fact about my perception that this phone is pink. It's merely a fact, a contingent fact about this phone. And I could just as well have like a red or a green or a purple or whatever kind of phone, right? But Kant thinks, okay, so you can focus on the matter of the thing that you are perceiving, but another way to proceed is to focus on its form, right? What are the things that hold in common between everything that I see and hear and experience and in general sense on an everyday basis? What are the conditions for me to see or perceive or anything like that? And Kant's answer to that question is that the conditions for our ability to perceive or sense objects is that those objects are in space and in time, right? I would never come across the particular items that I do if it were the case that they weren't in space or in time. Um, Imagine this, right? So like you can imagine an empty space, right? Or at least like what I imagine is like I imagine like kind of like a computer program that's like modeling, right? It's supposed to like create various sort of like textures and stuff like that that can show up on a computer screen, right? So you can build out an empty space, right? You can be like, this is where something would go, but there's nothing there right now, right? For Kant, what this kind of shows is that for anything that we can have an intuition of a singular thing about, it shows up in space and in time, right? And so what that shows for Kant is that space and time are not objective things existing out there in the world, right? Newton kind of thought about space and time as like a giant container, right? And then everything in the world is just like in the container. And that's what makes space and time real. Kant's view is the opposite, and this is part of his Copernican revolution. The fact that every object that we see and perceive and experience is in space and time doesn't let us say that, space and time were like out there in the world, right? For Kant, all this allows us to say is that space and time are the a priori form or condition of anything that I can possibly experience, anything that I can have an intuition of. So imagine any object that you can see or hear or perceive in any way, right? So not a number, right? And now ask, is there any way that I can encounter that object in a way that is outside of space and time? So it doesn't show up in a particular place, it doesn't show up in a particular time, right? And Kant's answer is no, right? For any object that I can have any sort of sensible intuition of, they must be in space and they must be in time. And so Kant concludes that this is a necessary condition for our form of sensibility, right? So we can a priori, completely, through only rational means, know everything, right, that I can sense is going to be in space and it's going to be in time. I just know that because it's a fact about the nature of my own perception. And so for Kant, the fact that space and time are the pure forms of our sensibility is the foundation for mathematics, right? So consider that geometric example that I brought up last week, namely that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Now for Kant, if it did not hold that objects, that we can sense are going to be in space and they're going to be in time, then we would not be able to maintain that holds for certain, right? We couldn't like say, okay, the world is mathematically structured or something like that. We could only be kind of guessing, right? Where like, and this is sort of the position that Mendelssohn says, right? Mendelssohn says the way that mathematics works is you have to assume that it applies to the world in some way. And then once you do that, you have perfect knowledge, right? But obviously the sticking part is, how do we know that it applies to the world, right? And so Kant answers that question. He answers the quid juris question, or the actuality problem, by showing that space and time are actual to everything that we can sense and perceive, not because space and time is really out there in the world or something like that, but because space and time hold for everything that we can sense. Okay, so we can see how sensibility, even though it is the faculty about what we receive, right? It's the faculty of how we come to sort of take in the world. Even this sort of faculty has its own pure form. It has its own a priori principles. Because space and time are structured in a certain way, I can know with exactness certain facts about it. So, for example, that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, at least, when placed on a Euclidean plane. So, Kant believes that he's established now that we have certain limited a priori principles that stem from the fact that space and time are the pure forms of our intuition, and that these justify the domain of mathematics. Okay, now for the understanding. Let's proceed in the same order. So in terms of the ordinary usage of the understanding, what the understanding does is it creates concepts or rules, right? In sensibility, the world is in a way a blooming, buzzing confusion. And what I mean by that is, right, when we gave the example of sensing something like this phone, for example, right, we had to do it without a concept. We just said, like, this thing or something like that, right? So the understanding, when we come to understand the world, what we're doing is we're seeing how the world is intelligibly structured into rules, right? So, to give another example, when I come across things in my perception that are similar to one another, as in this case, right? I can say that there are certain kinds of like distinguishing marks for what it means to be an object like this. So like a distinguishing mark of a pencil is exactly the fact that they have this little graphite end, and it's sort of written for human hands to be able to write with, and so on, right? And this is an empirical concept. It's an impure concept. It's a concept that gets one part, one share from the understanding, right? And one share from sensibility. One share from sensibility because I'm looking at these objects, I'm perceiving them, right? And then I'm comparing them. I'm creating a rule whereby I can be like, okay, anything that fulfills these requirements, I can call a pen. And so this is the ordinary case of the understanding. We just see things in the world. We begin to categorically determine them. We begin to organize them as they emerge in our world. Now, further, in the same way that there's a pure form of sensibility, there's a pure form of the understanding. And this can be very difficult to understand, right? What does it mean to have a pure form of the understanding? Well, what Kant has in mind is the universe is not structured in any way whatsoever. In no way is it unified, structured, organized, right? Then our experience would not be possible. In other words, there are some concepts, there are some rules that are like the rules for making rules, that are like the rules that make any sort of other rule make sense and applicable in these cases, right? And so it's the pure form of the understanding because these are the concepts for, in some way, describing concepts. They're not concepts to make to understand the world that we experience, at least not in a direct way. They, by contrast, are concepts that relate concepts to other concepts. So what are examples of this? Kant gives like 4 sort of like big categories that every concept that we have falls into. He calls these quantity, quality, relation, and modality, right? So just briefly, let's go through them, just to get a sense of what this means. So quantity, right? For anything that I perceive in the world, anything that I want to conceptually organize, it has a number, right? It's singular or plural or some combination of those two things, right? It has some kind of number. It has some relation to like what it means to be a number. Similarly, objects have some quality to them, right? The only way that I'm able to identify these two pens as each being pens is like, once again, I look at their distinguishing marks. I look at the fact that they have certain qualities together, right? Namely, that they are both useful for human beings to write things down, right? Relation, similarly, is how things sort of fit into the world as a whole, right? It's not important to understand the ins and outs of all of these categories. What's more important to see is just how it is that these categories are kind of what allow us to synthesize, to relate our concepts together with one another. And in the same way that it's inconceivable to imagine that we sense something outside of space and time, so too is it inconceivable that we have a concept of something that in no way interacts with, touches in any way the world of our experience, right? And this is, sort of the arguments that Kant was making against Hume. If Hume is right and all of our causal knowledge is just habit and happenstance and not really knowledge, then how is a coherent idea of experience even possible? Now, for Kant, therefore, the categories answer the actuality problem or the quid juris problem. We can know that they are actual because they are the conditions under which we have any sort of experience, right? And so then we can see how these categories then make up the pure a priori principles of physics. So, for example, the Newtonian idea that each action must have an equal and opposite reaction, that is itself, for Kant, merely a reflection of the category of causality, right? It's not conceivable that there be something in the universe that is not in some way part of the causal nexus of everything that's going around and happening. And so physics is authorized to make that inference. It can correctly assume that that is true for our experience. Okay, so this last category, or this last faculty, is the one that gives us all the trouble, right? And this is why Kant wrote the Critique of Pure Reason, right? Namely, that it's reason, whenever it enters into its pure use, that causes us trouble. Now, so the nature of reason is that reason is a kind of inferential knowledge. So reason is used not when we're trying to just understand, say, the things that I experience, right? I don't use reason whenever I say this is a pen or a pencil, right? I use reason whenever I make the further inference, and future pencils are going to look like this, right? And so what makes reason distinctive from the understanding is that reason is a way of connecting, right? It's a way of inferring, it's a way of going beyond the things that we experience. The understanding is in some ways always dependent on sensibility, right? At least in the cases outside of the categories, normally when we make a concept, it's dependent in some ways on having an intuition, right? I form concepts of things after I experience them. However, what reason does is reason takes the operations of the understanding and it extrapolates them, right? So, whenever I experience two things and I apply concept to it and I say these are pens, right? Then this is, a good normal case of knowledge. What reason then allows me to do is to be like, in everything that I see later that looks like this is going to be also a pencil, right? And so reason as an inference moves beyond the things that I sense and experience. In some ways, you can describe it as it takes the rules that are used by the understanding and expands them well beyond all the things that I can experience. So like whenever I make an inference about like all of the pencils, or I make an inference based on a natural scientific experiment about the average lifespan of rabbits or something like that, and I say it's not only true for these rabbits or pencils or whatever that I've experienced, but it's true even beyond that, right? Indefinitely into the future. At that moment, I am using reason. Now, reason, like the other two faculties, also has its pure form, right? And the pure usage of reason results in metaphysical ideas. So the idea here is that if I take inferences, right, I focus on what it means to draw an inference, and I take this to the limit, right? So, I infer things not only beyond the immediate parameters of my experience, but I start talking about the universe as a whole, or something like that, right? Then I'm getting into what Kant calls metaphysical ideas. So, as an example, Kant describes metaphysical ideas as basically those concepts that we talk about in metaphysics all the time, namely God, freedom, and the soul. These are categories extended beyond their legitimate domain of applicability, right? So, consider Leibniz, for example, and Kant always has Leibniz in mind. That what Leibniz did in some ways to develop his conception of God, to develop a metaphysical argument for God, is he just took the principles of physics. Every action is an equal and opposite reaction. Everything that happens in nature happens for a reason, right? He takes those principles and he extends them not just to the physical world, right? But then even beyond the physical world, right? So Leibniz says, in the same way that I can ask, like, why is this marker here? Or something like that, right? I can ask, why is the universe here? Why is there something rather than nothing, right? And Leibniz argues that the only avenue you will have for answering these questions is to begin to do metaphysics, to appeal to things like God, right? There has to be some reason for why this universe was created instead of some other universe where there's like maybe nothing in it. And so for Leibniz, there's a natural way that the understanding sort of moves beyond itself, that it begins by its own principle to make inferences into the nature of ultimate reality that we cannot experience, right? And this is the propensity of our understanding to engage in metaphysical speculations, right? But Kant thinks that he has developed a systematic and principled reason for why this inference that Leibniz makes from the legitimacy of these pure a priori concepts to metaphysics is wrong. Namely, that what happens in pure reason is that it loses its grip, right? It no longer has anything to do with our own experience. We imagine, in this case, that we can take on the perspective of God or something like that, right? And then we can just kind of reason from what we imagine God's perspective to look like. However, from Kant's perspective, our cognitive abilities are limited by the faculties that we have, right? We are dependent on outside things coming to affect us to get ideas of them. And in that way, we are nothing like God, right? We can have no insight into what God's understanding is like because our understanding as something finite is limited to those things that we can sense. So this is the sense of Kant's transcendental idealism. He agrees with the rationalists that there are a priori principles, synthetic a priori principles, and moreover, that if we did not have those principles, neither mathematics nor physics would make any sense, right? We would have no ability to accommodate or to make sense of the contemporary developments in modern science. However, what Kant establishes thereby is that the extension of this kind of thinking into metaphysics, into the nature of ultimate reality, beyond the domain of our possible experience, is illegitimate. That it doesn't produce something that we can have knowledge of, right? We have a way of checking, in some ways, the a priori principles of sensibility and understanding, namely because they apply to our experience, right? And in this way, Kant kind of agrees with the empiricists in that he agrees that the rationalists clearly take a priori principles beyond their legitimate extension. Where Kant disagrees with the empiricists, however, is in locating the specific boundary of that extension. Okay, this is getting rather long. I want to end it here so that, this is not too arduous or extended or anything like that. If you are very interested in Kant, there is an upper level Kant course that will be offered next semester. I would highly encourage all of you who are interested to take it. And once again, just from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for your effort in this class. It really does mean a lot to me. So thank you sincerely. Please be in contact with me if you have any questions about your final paper or anything related to the class. Thanks again. Have a great week. Hope the rest of your finals go great. Bye.